All right, 3, 2, 1. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest coming to us all the way from the Rock of Gibraltar in the south of Spain. His name is Tony Farrell, and he is a principal researcher on two what I think are very important films. One I saw many years ago, probably 5 years ago. It was titled 7/7 Ripple Effect, about all of the outright inconsistencies and deceptions in the so-called 7/7 terror bombings that took place in London in 2005. And there's another film they just put out, or in conjunction with the filmmaker Muad'Dib, titled The Hillsborough Ripple Effect. And many of my listeners in the U.S. may not know this story, but it was a disaster that took place at a soccer stadium in Sheffield, England. Primarily happened to Liverpool fans, and 96 people died. It was the 15th of April, 1989. But these researchers, primarily Tony, has come up has a different take on what the public knows, and this tragedy is still a topic of interest in the UK or in Britain, and we can get into that in greater detail. Tony, are you there?
I am indeed, and thank you for that introduction, William.
Awesome.
And thank you for the invitation for this.
Well, I'm really delighted. I'm delighted that you chose to be interviewed, because I really love, for me, one of the more important events of the George Bush administration and what happened under Tony Blair was the 2005 phony terrorist bombings in London. And there's so many inconsistencies. I watched that film 3 times. I just kept watching it over and over. The research was spot on. It was superb. So I do recommend people check that out. I think it's easier to find on YouTube than the Hillsborough Ripple Effect, which we're going to talk primarily about. But Tony's going to kind of link those two films together. So maybe to get started, Tony, you can talk a little bit about your background and how you became interested in the subject, and then we can talk about what happened at the Hillsborough soccer stadium.
Okay, that's fine. Yes, I want to take back to 2010, and I'd been a long-standing employee of South Yorkshire Police, headquarters in Sheffield. I was serving at the time as a principal intelligence analyst, and I fell foul, actually, of watching, 5 years after the event, the 7/7 Ripple Effect film. I stumbled across it. Now, it's hard to believe in one sense, but I was happy and content in my job at work as the principal intelligence analyst, scheduled to do a terror threat assessment before the chief constable, and only days before that presentation was due, I kind of woke up to the truth all of a sudden with a massive, great big jolt. And one of the instrumental things that was influential in my thinking was when I stumbled across the 7/7 Ripple Effect film, made by a gentleman that went by the peculiar name of Muad'Dib. I watched that 7/7 Ripple Effect film that you've watched and enjoyed 3 times, and it kind of shocked me to the core. It was the final nail in the coffin for me in terms of preserving my police career, which had been in existence for 17 years, because it brought me into immediate conflict with what...
Sorry, motorcyclists. Sorry.
All right. With what my employers were requiring me to state before the chief constable in a strategic threat assessment assignment I had. Now, that brought me in conflict because I didn't feel it appropriate to lie, given that I'd now come to the conclusion that the terror threat was bogus on the basis of research, internet research, that I'd stumbled across in the months before on 9/11 and in the days before on the 7/7 London bombings. So I went to my boss, Houston, we have a problem. Your principal intelligence analyst believes that the terror threat is bogus. Can you show me some proofs that it isn't? They turn around to me and says, Tony, don't rock the boat. You and I are just the government foot soldiers, and we will never get them to tell the truth on this, which was tantamount to an admission that it was dead right, that the terror threat is bogus, that 7/7 was an inside job, and that they weren't prepared to do anything about it. What's more, they were requiring me to peddle government lies in my strategic threat assignment. Well, I did rock the boat, and as you can guess, it kind of ended abruptly my career in the police service, where I was dismissed on grounds of an incompatible belief. And I took that all the way through the Employment Tribunal up to the Royal Court of Justice, where it was all wire pulled, and they were never going to let somebody like myself win on that, because it would have been a tantamount to a confession that the government was involved in the orchestration of the 7/7 false attacks had they allowed me to win.
Gotcha. Excuse me. What does wire pulled mean? I'm not familiar with that.
Well, it's just a kind of figure of speech that those pulling the strings
gotcha.
From the top. This was from the top down.
Okay, I understand.
This was from the government, but the government foot soldiers who were orchestrating the deceit incorporated my own employers, South Yorkshire Police, at the chief constable level and at various line management levels, where the personnel involved were complicit in the actual operation of the London bombings.
Gotcha.
And all that surrounded that. So it was a horrible realization, and one that brought me into immediate conflict. And I've got Muad'Dib, the gentleman that I work for now, to blame for that, because it was on the strength and persuasiveness of his excellent 7/7 video that I would encourage viewers to watch, if they haven't already seen it, which exposed the utter deceit over the London bombings.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't think I've seen a better video on the 7/7 London bombings.
I agree. It's the best one out there, I believe.
Yeah. But there is a story that runs parallel with my employment tribunal and what was happening to Muad'Dib Jah at the time. Now, Muad'Dib made that film. He kind of, unlike me, I took 5 years to realise the awful truth about the London bombings. He kind of spotted it from day one. And in 2007, he made that film. And he made it for the simple reason that 3 associates of the 4 London bombers that were blamed for it, that didn't do it, and that were actually assassinated, were actually being brought to a Crown Court trial at Kingston trial, and in an effort to prevent the perversion of the course of justice, Muad'Dib sent his DVD to the clerk of the court at that trial in order to prevent a perversion of the course of justice. Ironically, the British establishment, fearful of this film, this DVD, took exception to this and actually tried to extradite Muad'Dib from Ireland, where a 20-month battle ended up in Muad'Dib's extradition to England to face a Crown Court trial. And in total, he spent 157 days in prison before his trial eventually occurred at Southwark Crown Court, where the prosecution case against him made the fatal mistake of showing the jury the 7/7 ripple effect.
Wow.
And as a result of the jury actually watching the 7/7 ripple effect, the actual going against the judge's direction, the jury with a great big announcer with a great big smile on her face said that he was not guilty, much to the concern of the establishment, who deliberately messed Muad'Dib around at the time of the 7/7 inquest. The reason why they did that is that they feared Muad'Dib more than anything else for his DVD that was exposing the truth of the London bombings, that they could never allow the truth to come out. They took major steps to sort of try and ridicule and destroy the character of Muad'Dib, and the BBC played a complicit part in that, in the BBC conspiracy files, which did try to ridicule the 7/7 ripple effect. But to this day, it's the only documentary that I believe correctly draws the right conclusions and points the finger at the right people who were involved in the pulling off of the 7/7 bombings, the countenance of the perpetuation of the continued deceit of the bogus terror threat, and the various false flags that are happening. So Muad'Dib did a fine piece of work, and I congratulated him on it and thank him for it. And I am mighty pleased that I can say, in all honesty, that that was the instrumental thing that brought an end to my police career, which was the best thing that ever happened to me.
God, congratulations. For people who don't know, Muad'Dib is a reference to the science fiction book Dune by Frank Herbert, and it was the name given to kind of the principal figure in the book, Paul Atreides, when he was on this planet, Arrakis, and it was the kind of the name for the second moon, I think. It was the name he took on himself when he became part of the local kind of community there. But so that's the reference to it. And
the actual meaning of Muad'Dib means teacher of righteousness.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
And Muad'Dib chose, John Anthony Hill at the time, chose deliberately to go under that particular name in order to make himself more appealing to the Muslim community that needed to wake up to the bogus terror threat that was they were becoming the brunt of. And they weren't actually standing up for what the Holy Quran tells them to do, which is stand for truth. So Muslims, by and large, were accepting the deceitful narrative.
And what is
rather than challenging it?
Tony, maybe you can go into what the cover story or the deceitful narrative of 2005 and what Muad'Dib came to his conclusion, maybe briefly before we get into Hillsborough.
Yeah, there were plenty of documentaries, very good documentaries about the 7/7 ripple effects that completely destroyed the narrative. But essentially, Muad'Dib's documentary stood apart because it brought in the Canary Wharf dimension and whatever happened at Canary Wharf. Well, Muad'Dib made a strong hypothesis that actually 3 of the 4 bombers at least, the so-called bombers, were assassinated at Canary Wharf, and that they couldn't have been on. They didn't make their appointments with death on the underground, the 3 underground tube stations, and the overground bus that was had its top blown off, because they missed their connection train from Luton to the centre in London Underground to get their respective trains, where they'd had a previous terror drill 2 weeks before. So these were actually MI5 assets that were involved in a terror drill exercise, and they were sort of innocent patsies, really, believing that they were just partaking in a terror drill exercise, getting paid for it for the good of the nation. So when they missed their appointment with death, and just, by a stroke of of God's intervention, so to speak, they realised that they were actually meant to actually cop for it and take the blame. And all the forensic examination of the underground carriages are consistent with underground bombings in the tube on the trains themselves, rather than the narrative we're expected to believe, which is these were suicide bombers that blew themselves up with their backpacks. Right. All the forensics and the damage to the carriages were from bottom upwards. So it was bombs that came underneath the trains rather than, and all the injuries of all the passengers nearby were consistent with leg injuries from a blast coming from the floor upwards rather than from the backpacks. So there were all sorts of things, but they were the main ones. And actually, the lockdown at Canary Wharf, they had to be taken out because they were meant to have been on the trains and on the bus that got blown up. So they were assassinated at Canary Wharf, basically, or 3 of them were. So and that's been covered up to this very day. They're never going to admit the truth. Even my police officer, the director of intelligence, said, was admitting that it was like deceitful. Some of my other bosses were on the terror drill exercise on the day. This was all advertised in advance by the BBC Panorama programme in 2004, which was predicting, an almost identical scenario. So this was pre-programmed. And then the terror drill exercise on the day by Peter Power at the exact same tube stations and overground. All this is so improbable as to, this wasn't a coincidence. This had to be planned. It's the only plausible explanation. And this wasn't planned by Muslims. This was planned by agents of the state, probably involving Mossad and the British government.
Itself, right? And it was like, I think Netanyahu was in London at the time,
Yeah,
and Peter Power. There's a clip of him saying, "Oh yeah, we had a drill the same day." So you see the similarities, not just what's happening in the UK, but the same thing happens
yeah,
in the States.
I can't do justice to it all in 2 or 3 minutes, but
Sure.
people really do would do well to actually watch that film, and even if they've watched it before, watch it again.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I think that you're right. There are similarities in the whole event there and at Hillsborough. That it seems like when you research this and look at all these things that happened, it didn't happen. The deaths at Hillsborough, the stampede of 96 deaths, did not happen in a vacuum.
No, well, Moad Deeb, in a couple of years ago, working with myself as I was a former employee of South Yorkshire Police. Now, South Yorkshire Police, based in Sheffield headquarters, they were involved directly with the Hillsborough disaster. Now, for your listeners who may not be attuned at all to what happened, let me just briefly explain what happened in 1989 and why I believe it's still so important.
Right.
In 1989, there was a Football Association semi-final between Liverpool, who were the best team in Europe at the time, and Nottingham Forest. It was an exact same replica fixture from the year before, in 1988, when Liverpool, the supporters, were given the away supporters end at a neutral ground, which was Sheffield Wednesday, the Owls. And the Leppings Lane end was a notorious area for crowd problems, for problems with turnstiles, problems with the terraces, problems with ground capacity, where many people
and that's a specific entrance into that stadium, right?
Yeah.
And there were injuries in 1981, so and there were concerns too, written in papers that, hey, this thing's dangerous.
Yeah, so this was a disaster waiting to happen. And it was all configured so that we believe, anyway, and all the evidence points to this, that when Liverpool, who were by far and away the best team at the time in England and were pretty much certain to get through these rounds to the semi-final, they were actually awarded the away supporters end at the insistence of South Yorkshire Police. And South Yorkshire Police did some very peculiar things on the day. They switched the match commander in the last week or two and put in an experienced match commander, which we believe, on no uncertain terms, was just put in there as the useful idiot that would not know what to do in the circumstances. And he was replaced by somebody who knew the ground like the back of his hand and would have been able to prevent this disaster waiting to happen because of what he knew. And he kind of predicted that Duckenfield, the match commander, would mess it all up, and that's polite language. Now they did a dummy run, a neutral ground, the nearby ground in Barnsley, close to Sheffield, only a month before, where they allowed the away supporters at match time to freely surge through the gates and into the away crowd, away terraces, so that a kind of crushing situation was simulated. This was against the wishes of the football club, but it happened, and we believe that was a deliberate dummy run. There were all sorts of reasons, but what I would ask everybody to do here is do watch the Hillsborough Ripple Effect film, because what subsequently happened is 30 years of exquisite torment of the families of the 96 Liverpool supporters that lost their lives in a horrible crush. The first thing that happened was that all the blame was placed on Liverpool supporters immediately by top politicians, by the press, the media, particularly by Rupert Murdoch's Sun newspaper, who put scandalous lies out to demean the football fans, where alcohol was put forward as the blame for all this disaster. But it wasn't. It was all flaws in the stadium design, known flaws in the stadium design, and ineffective policing. Or at least that's how it seemed at the time. But what you'll find if you watch the Hillsborough Ripple Effect film, you will see the inferences that have been developed based on the facts over 30 years that lead me and Muad'Dib to the inevitable conclusion that this event, rather than being some catastrophic accident that went horribly wrong through negligence and neglect, was rather pre-planned as a deliberate exercise, right? Mm-hmm. And why the reason why we believe that was the case is when we look at cui bono, who benefits, you have to look at the personnel involved and how they've covered it up. And why on earth have they covered it up for 30 years? Rupert Murdoch, we believe, was heavily involved, along with Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister then, in 1989. And what they needed to do, because you have to look at the circumstances, that Liverpool Football Club had got the country in. That Liverpool supporters in a European Cup final match with Juventus in Heysel Stadium in Belgium in 1985 had been part of a problem of crowd control that went awry, where they charged across the terraces into the Italian fans who fled and got crushed against the wall that collapsed, where 39 victims met their death. And as a result of that, Liverpool, who were the best team in Europe at the time, got banned, and it became a disgrace for English football. Now, this was at a time when the terraces were all antiquated. You'd stand on the terraces, and it was downright dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, you can see in the Hillsborough ripple effect that the stadium really does look antiquated, and the stands, as we would call them here in the U.S., just looked like they were from the 20s or 30s, honestly.
Yeah, and what needed to happen in a time of great austerity in the United Kingdom at this point was investment to create a better image for football, which the cabinet, the Tory cabinet, the Conservative cabinet under Margaret Thatcher, who always hated Liverpool. She hated Liverpool from 1981 and the Toxteth riots. She hated Liverpool for Heysel disaster. And she and her cabinet all wanted all-seater stadium, but didn't have the kind of funds involved to pump prime all this, other than through the symbiotic relationship she had with Rupert Murdoch, who benefited, who was involved in the money with his pools business at the time, and ultimately was the major beneficiary of what came after, in the immediate aftermath of Hillsborough, which was pay TV and all-seater stadiums, and a revolution in the image of British football, which is the multi-billion business it is today. And it was little, when you look at all the clues, when you stand back and analyse all this, and I can't analyse it in the short time I've got, but an example being, it was Rupert Murdoch's newspaper, The Sun, that spread the lies from day one as to what was going on. They immediately said that Liverpool supporters were drunk, Liverpool supporters were interfering with the police operations, when the exact opposite was.
They were supposedly urinating on police. Like, that's unbelievable.
And top politicians in the Tory cabinet were helping to perpetuate the lies, spread first by the Sun newspaper and Kelvin Mackenzie under Rupert Murdoch. So this was a deliberate smear campaign, and for long enough the nation bought the lies. For long enough, Liverpool fans were demonised over Hillsborough, and it became known as like the city of self-pity. But
gotcha. For people who don't know, all the Liverpool fans had to travel to Sheffield. They were the visiting, group, so they were all kind of herded off a train into this crush. So, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. There was a crush. The problem was there was no effective orchestration and management, both outside the terraces and inside the terraces. Everything that was designed about this was meant to be a disaster waiting to happen. So the poor match commander in control of this, who was brought in at the 11th hour, had a disaster waiting outside when everybody was being crushed, because the turnstile capacity was completely inappropriate for the number of fans that were arriving and that were asked to arrive a mere 15 on the tickets themselves, a mere 15 minutes before kick-off. So he was damned if he didn't open the gates, and he was damned if he did. In the end, in order to prevent a fatalities outside the stadium where people were getting crushed, decisions were made to open up the gates, and in order to relieve the pressure from outside. So in came the incoming crowd, relieved of the pressure, heading straight for the tunnel in the central behind the goalpost. And there was 4 segments to the away terraces, which you could get to by going down the steps, quite steps through the tunnel, the central tunnel. And what happened, instead of people evenly dispersion through all 4 sections of the terraces, and by this, the terraces were actually fenced and confined with wire meshing, so there was no escape route here. You were in the terrace compartments, and that was it. So everybody went down this steep tunnel, not into the side terraces by the corner flags, but in the immediate place, 2 terraces behind the goalposts. So that was those 2 terraces at the away end were full very quickly, with people heading for that on a steep embankment, eager to get into the match in time for kickoff. Meanwhile, the adjacent 2 terraces at the away supporters end, were relatively empty. But there was no get out. The crowd at the front couldn't get out, and they all were crushed. And the police, by and large, were on their field treating this as a crowd disorder rather than a health and safety issue, even though visual images show that people were being crushed to death and that the police seemed, relatively speaking, ineffective at realising what was before them. They were like rabbits in headlights. All sorts of bizarre decisions. I can't go and do justice to everything that's happened here, so I would urge everybody to watch the Hillsborough Ripple Effect film, because the story just doesn't end there. We've had 30 years from the first inquest and the perverse decision making by the coroner in that, through various prosecutions that have all gone against the Liverpool supporters up until recent times. The one thing that I think is different about this, and why I highlight it and why I think it's so important, is thanks to the tenacity and the dignity of the Liverpool supporters and the families who fought this injustice for 30 years and managed to actually get turn the mindset of the British nation somewhat against the government on this. It kind of, I've often said, it's kind of the Achilles heel in the government, and could be one of those key things that actually bring the government down and actually bring the corruption to light in ways that in other kind of incidents, even the bigger incidents, it's always difficult to do. The reason being is that within the community of Liverpool itself, you can galvanise a community like nothing else. And there lies the threat to the establishment who've covered all this up. And the families have never given up in their pursuit for justice. And in recent times, a second inquest, the first inquest, which happened in 89-90, was quashed, right? And then the second inquest took place. And that second inquest eventually exonerated the families of the blame for what had happened, and actually came out with a verdict of unlawful killing.
That was the one in 2014, is that right?
That's right. Yes.
2014 to 2016.
That was at Birchwood. Sorry, 2016, more recent than that.
Okay.
And under a judge called Goldring, at a place not too far away from Liverpool, eventually the families were exonerated of all blame for Hillsborough, and that the verdict was unlawful killing. There were issues. There was a protected species that I briefly want to come on to, which was a police officer who was the most senior ranking police officer in the stadium that day. And this is where my insight is useful as to what actually really happened and what was being covered up. Because the match commander who's faced a criminal trial recently, where there was a hung jury, is David Duckenfield.
This
was after 39 years. His boss, who helped switch him at the last minute into this invidious position of being match commander in a disaster waiting to happen, was his boss called Walter Jackson, who was an assistant chief constable. Walter Jackson was off duty at the time, and by several reliable accounts was in the director's box drinking and drunk at the time. Now, what happened? This has been covered up because on the 20th, and this is the reason why I know this, is that on the 20th anniversary of Hillsborough, I was still an employee of South Yorkshire Police. A press officer who was there on the day, who was accompanying David Duckenfield, a match commander, all that morning and well into the afternoon, came up to me in the canteen and told me a story about what he witnessed firsthand on the day. And what he told me has never been disclosed in the control box, the vital control room that was overlooking the deaths and the fatalities that were happening beneath them in the Leppings Lane end, and from that vantage point. So what happened? Andy Hymas is the press officer working for South Yorkshire Police who sat down with me and spilled the beans in the canteen on the 20th anniversary. And he said, Tony, I've just been in with the chief constable an hour ago, and he says, I've had to go through it all again. He confessed to me that he'd been in the stadium that day working with David Duckenfield, and he said, this is what happened. He was outside the stadium just about match time, kick-off time. He saw loads of ambulances just waiting, and he got a phone call from headquarters to make his way inside to the control box that was overlooking the Leppings Lane end where all the crushing was occurring, because the headquarters were not getting any sense from the control box as to what was happening in this unfolding catastrophe. So Andy Hymas made his way straight to the control box steps, went up the steps, knocked on the door, which he found was locked. Inside were Duckenfield and those with the CCTVs, with the perfect vantage point of the stadium, both with CCTVs and through the windows overlooking Leppings Lane end. Andy Hymas wasn't let in, so he gets back into headquarters on the phone, sir, saying, they're not letting me in, sir. Well, in expletive terms, they said, well, effing knock the door down if you have to, we need to know what's going on. So Andy Hymas, a relatively junior press officer of South Yorkshire Police, knocked on the door again, insisted that he was let in, and he was duly let in. Then he discovered the truth as to why he was being locked out, because amidst the mayhem and the drama and the horror that everything was unfolding in the confines of a control box overlooking all the deaths below was a table underneath which the assistant chief constable, Walter Jackson, was hid. Wow. At a vital moment. He was hid crying like a gibbering idiot.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, it's just amazing, yeah. And 44 ambulances were outside the stadium, and only 3 came on the pitch.
Only one was let in.
Right, like it's all kinds of weird ineptitude and inability to take action. It's just incredible.
Now, Andy spilled the beans with me on the 20th anniversary at a time when I wasn't even though I was a principal intelligence analyst, I'm kind of ashamed to say that I wasn't particularly attuned with Hillsborough. I never got asked to look at it. But it was at a time when shortly after this, I got thrown out of the police for speaking truth to power over the 7/7 London bombings, when I wouldn't bear false witness. So I was then going through my employment tribunal when Hillsborough surfaced again, when there were issues to do with the 20th year disclosure, where Margaret Thatcher's files had been covered up on the Hillsborough event up until that point. So I suddenly put my brain in gear and remembered the 20th anniversary and the discussion Andy Hymas had shared with me in the canteen. And it was only then that at that point that I put my brain in gear and then started to research and realised that what Andy told me, none of that had been disclosed in any of the court proceedings. Wow. Which meant that, to my way of thinking, that I searched high and low for anything that made reference to this. Andy Hymas himself had not made reference. His statement that he put in 1989 was totally at odds with the account he gave to me in the staff canteen 20 years later as to what really happened. Which kind of, if he had no reason to make that up in front of me. So I was by this time convinced that not only Andy Hymas had covered up the truth, but every single police officer who had been responsible in the control box for the oversight of crowd safety, was also covering up the truth about what really happened and about Walter Jackson's dysfunctional appearance in the control box, where he was worse for wear for whatever reason.
There's video evidence of Duckenfield and Jackson kind of walking around on the pitch of the soccer field, kind of aimless, not really being a part of anything, just walking around oblivious. Very strange, super suspicious. And there's tons of, like, the movie showed that there's evidence or people talking about, hey, we all got to keep our stories straight. We got to, or we're all going to hang. So there's a lot. And the cover-up lasted all the way to today. Duckenfield is still in some form of civil litigation, is my understanding, about the cases.
He faced a criminal trial. Following the inquest, there was Crown prosecution made a decision to charge 6 people. And Duckenfield faced the main charges of 95 counts of unlawful killing through negligence. And so Duckenfield has just faced a Crown Court trial along with other officers. Now, Duckenfield, the jury has cleared, it's not cleared Duckenfield, there was a verdict which meant that it wasn't decisive. So the Duckenfield may have to face a retrial. So the jury was unable to reach a verdict on whether Duckenfield was guilty. But I'm not surprised in the slightest that the jury reached that verdict, because it was all rigged beforehand. Because the actual the problem here lies in the Crown Prosecution Service and the cover-up of the planned event. You see, now Duckenfield, I think, didn't even have to sort of give witness himself. He refused to give witness, and he had psychiatrists saying he was unfit to give witness testimony in his defence, and even that didn't count against him. So the jury were unable to reach a verdict on him, which probably now means that he's far more certain to get off second time round. Right. You seldom get this overturned if the jury wasn't able to reach a verdict. It favours the defence case rather than the prosecution case when such a thing happens.
And this just happened like April 2019. I mean, it's last month.
Yeah, last month, and I was over in the UK for part of that trial, and we did something interesting, because I was so horrified with what was going on, and taking an example of what Muad'Dib did, because Muad'Dib, back in relation to the 7/7, submitted his 7/7 ripple effect to the clerk of the court in a Crown Court trial of 3 associates of the London bombings, and for that he himself faced a criminal trial for trying to pervert the course of justice, as I've already referred to. So in repeating this, knowing that having had involvement on making this film with Muad'Dib, with Jar, we decided that the opportunity presented itself to submit an amicus curiae brief in the form of the DVD to the judge in Preston Crown Court. And there was some irony in this, because Muad'Dib's defence barrister from 2005 was the prosecution barrister in the Hillsborough case against Duckenfield. Wow. So I had a linkage there, and was able to catch her attention and present her with a DVD, send Muad'Dib's best wishes, give to her and make a request to her to actually present this to the court as an amicus curiae brief before the judge, which duly happened. So the actual Hillsborough ripple effect was placed in the court. Now, they chose not to do anything with it, other than actually serve an exclusion order on me that I couldn't go into Preston and watch the rest of the Crown Court. But interestingly, some of the barristers in their summing up referred to the elephant in the room, and I believe since that the elephant in the room refers to the fact that all parties knew the existence of the Hillsborough ripple effect and could have used it, which would have blown the lid completely open about the real motives of Hillsborough had it been shown to the jury. It would have shown that the actual the fault of this lies in the establishment and the Crown Prosecution Service in fabricating the charges against them that were doomed to fail in the first, and they knew it, in order to protect those that are guilty. Right. And so what's happening here is that the exquisite torment of the families of the 96 has not stopped. It keeps going and going and going on, and is showing no signs of abating. The families members who've tried to battle bravely, ever so bravely to this point, are kind of not getting any younger and are running out of steam because they've been exhausted. The lawyers in the gravy train are part of it. They've been shown the video, but they are doing whatever they can to avoid it getting into the court system. So the conspiracy to cover it up continues, in spite of evidence that this was a planned event. Now, if it was a planned event, if what we're saying is true here, then the charges should not be for unlawful killing, all placed on the shoulders of one police officer who was brought in at the last moment, but on about those parties that planned the event. And I believe that the senior command team of South Yorkshire Police, in full complicit conduct with senior members of the Football Association and the government cabinet, were instrumental in planning an event that would allow the conditions to enable the multi-billion pound business that we see as the football premiership now to get up and running, with Murdoch being the chief beneficiary through his battering ram of pay TV to make his fortune. And football was the medium that he would use, and that he knew that would make him filthy stinking rich. And he was prepared to go to any lengths to get this through in complete complicity with the Tory cabinet, who had good reason to want this to go through.
But there was also the beneficiaries of the rebuilding the stadium, retrofitting, upgrades to different seats, etc., that happened after the tragedy, right?
Yeah, and all the beneficiaries were from the Football Association.
Gotcha.
Right. So, and I just want to mention some of their family members, and how I'd love them to wake up to the terrible. They've gone through such an ordeal, and my heart goes out to them all. But they've kind of been confronted. There's an irony here, because I believe that the truth is finally coming out, and the irony is that it's coming out from a former employee of South Yorkshire Police, and the truth is kind of too hurtful for them to actually absorb. But Margaret Aspinall is the head of the football, is the chairperson of the Hillsborough Family Support Group, and she's campaigned tirelessly. And now, this is what was wrong with the second inquest. The Football Association were immune from any of the coroner's questions that were put to the jury. Now, the Football Association appointed a lawyer, right, called James 18, which is a very peculiar name to have a surname called 18, but the lawyer was called James 18. And I believe that was a deliberate choice, even if it wasn't a fabricated name. Why do I say that? Because James was the name of Margaret Aspinall's son that died and in the stadium in the disaster, and he was 18 when that happened. This is kind of an exquisite torment that it was ongoing. That didn't happen by accident. They were doing that and were getting a kick out of doing that and prolonging the exquisite torment without the families necessarily noticing the evil that was being perpetrated before their very eyes. They've kind of thought, well, the corner was turned in 2010 when the disclosure files were happening, when the Hillsborough Independent Panel sort of condemned the establishment, and that they thought at that point that at long last they're going to get some justice. But when we look at it to date, the only person that's been held accountable so far in 30 years of tireless campaigning by the families and no end of court appearances be they inquests, prosecutions, private prosecutions, or criminal trials, the only person that's been held account so far is the football secretary, the former football secretary of Sheffield Wednesday, and he's just been convicted for negligence, where the fine is £6,500.
Wow.
When we the gravy train of the lawyers that have basked in the glory whenever the families have appeared to get justice, the millions that the fees that have been put in to these lawyers, who then celebrate their victories and pretend that the families have had justice. And what the families need to do is realise that far from justice, they are still being duped. And they need to wake up to that. And the only way they're going to realise that is if they take the side of none other than Muad'Dib, who was sent specially for them in order to shed light on the Hillsborough. Muad'Dib himself, in his body, was born in the city of Sheffield. And that is not, and there's a reason for that perhaps is not for today. Gotcha. I think at this point in time, if it's appropriate, I don't know how long we've got left now. But,
anytime, maybe 5-10 minutes. I mean, we're at 46 minutes total right now. So
I would just like to play, if it's possible, to play some BBC commentary on the day itself in 1989. It only lasts for a minute, but it's an unusual piece of commentary that I believe is very prophetic.
Okay.
So is it possible to quickly load that up?
I am loading it as we speak. Let's see. Here we go. Hopefully it'll come through. If it doesn't...
Well, I think the biggest
Can you hear that?
irony is that the sun is shining now. And
yes, that's fine.
Try it again.
I think the biggest irony is that the sun is shining now and Hillsborough's quiet, and over there to the left, the green Yorkshire Hills. And who would have known that people would die here in the stadium this afternoon? I don't necessarily want to reflect on Heysel, but I was there that night broadcasting with Emlyn Hughes, and he was sitting behind me this afternoon. And after half an hour of watching stretchers going out and oxygen cylinders being brought in and ambulance sirens screaming, he touched me on the shoulder and he said, "I can't take any more," and Emlyn Hughes left. The gymnasium here at Hillsborough is being used as a mortuary for the dead. And at this moment, stewards have got little paper bags and they're gathering up the personal belongings of the spectators, and there are red and white scarves of Liverpool and red and white bobble hats of Liverpool and red and white rosettes of Liverpool, and nothing else. And the sun shines now.
So that was commentary in the aftermath of disaster. It would have been, the kickoff would have been 3 o'clock. This would have been commentary analysis around about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening in the stadium itself. And there were some interesting things that were said that I believe are quite prophetic, and were kind of telepathically given to that BBC commentator. And I think it says the sun shines now, and it talks about the hills in Sheffield. John Anthony Hill, Jar, is the filmmaker that's actually exposing the full truth to the families of what really happened that day, like nobody else has ever done. There has been some fine documentaries on Hillsborough, but nothing compares with the conclusions that I believe are correctly drawn in Muad'Dib's film. And Muad'Dib is, as I mentioned, stands for the teacher of righteousness, and it relates to who Muad'Dib really is, which is Elijah, which is detailed in the last book of the Old Testament. And he's come to as the son of righteousness to shed light on Sheffield, where his human body was born in 1948. This is highly prophetic, and this is one of the reasons why I have no doubt in saying that we haven't heard the last of Hillsborough. There is a retrial in September, and 2 other police officers are facing criminal trials in September. But I hope and pray that the families wake up to the awful truth and have the one last piece of courage to conflict the real culprits behind this. And what that will need to entail is that people like Margaret Aspinall, who lost her son James, 18, tragically, have made one mistake, I think, in the brave and courageous campaign and dignified campaign and that is to accept honours from the establishment, despite the fact that it's the establishment's point that the establishment to blame for them never having justice. So they've kind of fallen into the sweetener trap and accepted prematurely awards and gongs, knighthoods, etc. And they're not alone with that, because the Bishop of Liverpool, who chaired a major report on the Hillsborough Independent Panel, and wrote a fine article called The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power, which told the stories, the tragic stories of how the victims have been treated. He revealed and exposed the corrupt nature of the establishment, yet for his work on Hillsborough, he was duplicitous enough to accept a knighthood from the Queen, who's responsible for giving knighthoods left, right and centre to all those, and the list is endless. And my Jar Talk article called Inside Out just documents all the culprits of Hillsborough who've been richly rewarded. Here in hell, no bad deed goes unrewarded and no good deed goes unpunished. And that's the perverse situation that we're in at the moment. What I would urge the families to do, if any of them are watching this, is to continue the fight, but they need to fight differently. They need to turn the tables on the establishment, and there could be no greater tokenistic gesture than for Margaret Aspinall and Trevor Hicks, who tragically lost two of his daughters, teenage daughters, in Hillsborough, and has been a tireless campaigner, to actually ceremoniously dump their medals that they previously unwisely accepted. But maybe they accepted it for a reason, and that is that the time surely now has come for them to reject the establishment that actually has covered this up and richly rewarded those that have been responsible for its cover-up in the past. And there's one other person I want to mention, seeing as I'm talking to a largely American audience here, and this is a politician named Andy Burnham, who has spoken very eloquently in the past about the injustice. He was kind of Home Secretary towards, under the era of Tony Blair, and has been highly critical of Tony Blair's protection of Rupert Murdoch over the investigations over Hillsborough in the past. Andy Burnham became a mayor of Manchester at a time when the Manchester Arena false flag attack happened. Andy Burnham spoke very eloquently in the House of Commons, criticising the establishment. I don't think that connection between him then ceasing to be a politician and becoming a mayor, and then Manchester itself being subjected to a false flag, is entirely unconnected.
Interesting.
What Andy Burnham, instead of calling out, I wish Andy Burnham would stand up and call it out now for what it really is, in the same way he did a few years ago. What Andy Burnham chooses to do is, rightly or wrongly, partake in events such as the Boston Marathon, where he runs for charity. Please know, everybody, that the date of the Boston Marathon, 15th of April, which was the same date, 15th of April, that Hillsborough happened. This is not... Now, Andy Burnham should be calling that out too, rather than actually kind of going along with the government, having first been highly critical of it. So we've got to a stage now where the people seem to have let Hillsborough sort of just dwindle away. And I think there's still one last opportunity in September coming that Hillsborough could still explode in the faces of the government, and it could be so bad and unite a community in Liverpool that is a very tight-knit community, that if this film, the Hillsborough Ripple Effect film, could start to be embraced far and wide, it is one film that could, with the help of the Liverpool supporters and the Liverpool families, could actually do immense damage to the credibility of not just the current Conservative government, but the governments that have been in charge ever since 1989, the successive governments, which will probably expose to the people the sheer extent of corruption within our midst and galvanise support in ways that other false flag attacks around the country, both here and in elsewhere in your country in America, have perhaps failed to actually galvanise that level of support needed to be a tipping point in order for good to prevail over evil. At the moment, in over every single kind of aspect, we're seeing evil prevail over good, and that's got to change. And maybe Hillsborough, seemingly not so important in the overall scheme of things, is one event, and I firmly believe could, because partly of Moeddib's input, be immensely important in the overall scheme of things.
Cool.
So I would ask listeners to watch this space, watch the video, and watch what happens in September when the criminal trials restart.
Excellent. And where can people see the Hillsborough ripple effect?
Well, if they just Google search Hillsborough ripple effect, and just a simple Google search, and Jar or Moeddib. Moeddib is MUAD
DIB
apostrophe DIB.
And then
that will lead you on to the Hillsborough ripple effect film.
And then the other film is 7/7 Ripple Effect
Ripple
as
Effect.
well. So those are both watchable. And if people want to reach out and talk to you or share information with you, how can they contact you?
Yeah, well, my email address is tony@jartruth.net. I'll just repeat that. tony@truth.net.
Gotcha. And
I've
again,
got my own website called Jar Talk, and some of the pages on that analyse extensively the Hillsborough situation and actually provide the evidence of all the hundreds of people who have been richly rewarded over Hillsborough.
just covering it up. And you talk about masonry in the film. You talk about dates, numerology. So there's a lot in the film that we didn't cover specifically, but I highly recommend people check that out. Very important film. And again, it's Tony Farrell. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'd ask people to check out who Moeddib really is.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. Tony, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.